Hello and welcome along to the Panto podcast. This week my guest is theatre director Ken Alexander. We talk about writing pantomime, how he gets the best from his performers and creatives, and the biggest difference between pantomimes in England and Scotland. So please sit back and enjoy the latest Panto podcast. My guest for today's Panto podcast is theatre director Ken Alexander. Hello, Ken.
Hi, great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So, how did you actually get started off then in the business?
In theatre?
In theatre.
Well, it was actually through a route that most people go through, which was kind of school shows and then amateur drama clubs. But ultimately, the thing that got me really hooked on theatre was when I was 13, I was taken to see a production of Oliver at Leicester Haymarket Theatre, which was... it was actually Cameron Mackintosh in conjunction with the Haymarket at that time, and it was Roy Hudd playing Fagin, and it was just before it went into London. So it was 1977, I think. And as a young kid watching this show, I was just utterly hooked on how this story came to life. It was the original Sean Kenny revolving design, and these amazing performers and this big orchestra and hundreds of kids my age on stage. And I just thought, wow, this is something that's totally different. And I bought the record, the album, which had been recorded with the Leicester Children's Choir, who were in the show, and I wrote down every single lyric and I just listened to it endlessly. So that kind of piqued my interest. But my first actual paid job in a theatre was again at the Haymarket in Leicester. I was born in Glasgow but brought up in the Midlands, and I got a job with my best pal from school at front of house, selling programmes, taking tickets, and then got involved backstage doing LX get-outs and working on the stage door and then the green room. And it kind of started there. And then I went away to study music and drama, actually here in Newcastle at Newcastle Poly. I did a creative arts degree with music as my main subject and drama as my second. But that drama kind of took over as a main interest, although music has always remained a very important part of what I do. And then I eventually moved on to doing a trainee director's bursary through the Scottish Arts Council at Perth Theatre.
How do you find then going to the theatre now? Do you still get that same buzz?
I do. And actually the shows I love are the ones where I can forget that I work in the theatre. I can just get completely kind of taken up by the story and the performances and the staging of a show. Obviously there are some shows where you get less involved and you're looking at it perhaps a wee bit with more of a critical eye, but I love being swept away by a really good show.
What about then treading the boards yourself? Have you ever been tempted?
Absolutely not. I did a wee bit as a kid, obviously, through schools and college and stuff. And actually, as my training as a director, I trained with a wonderful director called Joan Knight, who was the artistic director at Perth Theatre for over a quarter of a century. And she made sure that as part of my training, I did work on the stage management team, on the stage crew. So I was learning the business from every angle, and she also felt it was really important that I learned what it was like to be directed by somebody. So I had to do a small part in a play called Born Yesterday while I was at Perth Theatre. But it absolutely confirmed that that's not what I wanted to do. I was much more interested in the process of drawing a production together and pulling all the different resources together.
So when it comes then to actually spotting performers that you'd like to bring the best out in as well, what's your process with that?
I think, for me, the key to any successful production is a genuine collaboration between you and the whole of the rest of the team, including the design team, the actors and so forth. So it's about tapping into what an actor brings a show and actually giving them the freedom to perform to their best ability. And obviously you have a job as a director to steer a production and to pull a production together. So that in itself is a skill, I think, that is often overlooked in how to get a team of really talented people and get them all moving in the same direction. But I'm really most excited by the collaborative process of theatre, and I think that's what drew me to it in the first place.
And do you find that pantomime is a different discipline altogether than, shall I say, a normal theatre show?
It has its individual quirks, that's for sure, but the process for me is exactly the same. Ultimately, I believe in Panto, it's important that you tell a good story, but at the same time, you need to enjoy the comedy, the music, the dance, the apparent anarchy that a Panto could provide. But it is ultimately the same process that you have to have a thing that gels at the end of the day, where every aspect of it comes together and everybody has a chance to shine.
Did you go and see many pantomimes then as a child?
Do you know, I came to Panto really late. My first experience as a Panto was, I think, when I was about 6 or 7. My mum and dad had moved to Birmingham from Glasgow, and my dad's work did a works outing to the local Panto, which I think must have been Birmingham Hippodrome. And I remember really clearly it being Les Dawson in Robinson Crusoe, playing Robinson Crusoe's brother. Now, even at that young age, I thought, that doesn't make sense. He was on the island on his own. Why is his brother there? So that was my first experience. And I didn't go to another Panto until actually I was a student in Newcastle, and I went down to Sunderland Empire to see Stanley Baxter in Mother Goose. And I never looked back after that.
Oh, well, what a man to go and see in pantomime.
Absolutely.
Well.
I mean, he was brilliant. And what I didn't know was there were people in that company who I went on to work with later on, who I got to know once I'd moved into theatre professionally. But it was an extraordinary performance, and obviously he was full of everything you would expect of Stanley Baxter, amazing costumes, spectacle, but he was genuinely funny as well. And I remember that really clearly. And then my first job out after I left Newcastle was at Perth Theatre, where they had a really strong tradition of a company panto. So Perth at that time was a full-time repertory theatre. So instead of a star panto, all the actors who'd been in the season would then be cast in various parts in the panto. So it was very much a company-led panto as opposed to a star-led panto. But it was very Scottish, very traditional, beautiful designs, and again, comedy was really to the fore, but lots of good singing and music. There was a legendary musical director in Perth, a guy called John Scrimger, he's still with us. He's in his 90s now, John. But the quality of the music was amazing. And that's when I first began to really appreciate the craft of Panto and what it took to draw the different elements of Panto together. So I suppose as an adult really is where my appreciation of Panto really started to grow.
And do you go and see, I know you direct and produce your own, and do you go and see many others now?
I try to see as many as I can. Obviously that depends on how busy I'm directing pantos myself during the season. But yes, I'm particularly, because I'm based in Scotland, although I kind of work all over the country, but I see a lot of the pantos in Scotland, which it's really interesting because sometimes I feel that some of the traditional elements of Panto are getting lost because people are so busy trying to reinvent the form. Now, having said that, I've seen some brilliant reinvention of Panto. There's a guy in Scotland called Johnny McKnight. I don't know if you've come across him at all, but some of his Pantos have been brilliant, which root themselves in Panto traditions but are entirely modern. But myself personally, I'm very interested in a traditional Panto but with a contemporary edge to it.
What was your first production then that you actually directed?
It was at Perth Theatre, where I was a trainee director, and it was Aladdin. I think it was my second year as a trainee director. Joan Knight, who I mentioned earlier, said, "Right, darling, I think it's about time you learn to do Panto." So she'd had me assisting, in a couple of years prior to that, she'd had me assisting another director, Clive Perry, on the Perth Panto. She said, "Right, it's time you went out on your own and did this." So not only did she ask me to direct it, she asked me to write the book. And in those days in Perth, what they used to do was the director, either Joan herself or the visiting director who was doing the show, would create the story structure, and then Walter Carr, who was a really well-known Scottish panto dame who happened to live in Perth, even sometimes he was in the show, sometimes he wasn't, but he would write the comedy routines and jokes and set pieces. And Wally, I suppose at that stage, must have been in his late 60s or early 70s, absolutely steeped in this rich tradition of Panto. He actually used to do King's Edinburgh, King's Glasgow as Dame, and took over Stanley Baxter's pantos from him. I saw him do the Mother Goose that Stanley had done in Sunderland, which Wally then did in Glasgow. So he had this amazing knowledge of panto. He was a lovely, warm Dame, very funny, principally an actor, but an actor with a variety experience and interest as well. So I couldn't have asked for a better start, really, because I was completely green as far as it came to writing panto. So Wally kept me right, and we worked together on the script, and then I got to direct the show, but with someone else playing Dame. And then the following year I did Dick Whittington. I learned a lot from the first year, and a lot of it worked, and other bits didn't. Like we fell into the usual trap of overwriting it, so there was far too much material, and we ended up cutting to get the running time down. The second year I did Dick Whittington, and Wally played Dame in Dick Whittington that year, so we again collaborated on the script, and he was very generous in letting me bring my ideas to it, even though he knew the business inside out. But he was such a funny man, and a beautiful Dame. Really fabulous.
What kind of ideas then were you bringing?
Well, just looking again at something that kind of underlines a lot of the shows, that are looking at how you tell the story, making sure that you are actually telling the story properly, and that there's a thread and a journey from beginning to end. But then looking at ways where you can kind of tweak that around, like in that Dick Whittington. When the big fight between King Rat and Dick at the end of the show that year, what we did was that Tommy the cat dived in to save Dick from getting stabbed by King Rat, and pushed Dick out of the way, and Tommy actually took the blade and died on stage.
Oh, no.
So the audience then had to do a kind of Tinkerbell thing to bring Tommy back to life, and it was a bit of a departure, but actually it worked beautifully, because the audience by that stage were taking the story so seriously, as well as all the comedy and mayhem. They were taking the story seriously, so there was a gasp when he got killed, but then kind of cheers when he was brought to life again. So,
do you think there has to be that element of pathos as well within pantomime?
I do, and that's something I actually learned from Clive Perry, who was a director, one of the directors I trained with at Perth. He used to run Birmingham Rep, and at that stage he was running Pitlochry Festival Theatre, but used to do a lot as a guest director at Perth. So Clive taught me the importance not only of getting the laughs, but making sure that there was a truth to the characters, and that as you say, the pathos was brought to the fore as well. So you should be able to feel and cry in a panto as well as laugh and enjoy the nonsense as well.
Yes. What then do you think creates that magic of pantomime?
I think it's all the different elements, because in many ways it's like a big musical, but it's also like a big variety show. And I think if you can tap into all of those elements and balance them, that's for me what creates the perfect panto. You see a lot of pantos where variety is to the fore, you see a lot of pantos where the story is to the fore, but I think if you can strike the balance and get all of it in, that's for me the most enjoyable type of show.
Have there been times when it's been a real challenge?
On shows I've worked on?
Shows you've worked on?
Yes, I mean I've I suppose in the last 12 years, 15 years maybe, I've started to do more commercial pantos, whereas the ones I did in Perth were very much a local, traditional company panto. So moving from that into the commercial world, where you're working with star names, you're working with speciality acts, I had quite a lot of learning to do, because obviously still as a director, and even in those shows, your job is to make sure you tell the story, but you also have to create room for the speciality acts to do their stuff and to shine. And I learned an awful lot. I was working with ventriloquists and impressionists and comedians for the first time, as well as musical theatre people who were coming in to do other roles in the shows, and they're very different disciplines. So the big learning curve for me was how to give people enough room to do the job they're paid for, and to do it as well as they possibly can, but at the same time pull the whole thing together.
And to allow everybody to shine on that stage.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
ever become a problem though, when there's kind of a name that wants to be a little bit, somebody's top of the bill and they want to kind of outshine? How do you kind of rein people in?
I do think you have to give people their status. If you've got a headliner, generally speaking, they're there for a reason because they bring something special to a show. I've been really fortunate in that I haven't worked with anybody who has just been a megalomaniac,
Diva, yeah.
Absolutely. People have generally been there. And if there has been any insecurity from, a lead name, it's because they want to do the job as well as they can. And they've also got to live up to what people got from them last year and make it better. So, there are pressures on them as well. And it's your job as director to make sure they do as good a job as possible. So I've been lucky in that I haven't had anybody who's been kind of elbowing their way to the front, and occasionally you do have to rein people in and encourage performers to trim the material down. Especially when I've worked with Kudos, they're very strict on running time. They want the first act to be no more than around an hour, and the second act usually under an hour, because they really believe that Panto can outstay its welcome. And I do remember those days of going to see those big Pantos which had multiple names on the bill, so everybody had to get a shot, but the Panto running time was about 3 hours. So it's important that you kind of have a discipline to a show as well. And as a director, in those circumstances, you have to apply the discipline. And sometimes that means being unpopular by getting people to cut material. And it's horrible, especially when someone's material is really good, but you've got to get the running time down.
Lots of pressures then. How does your year kind of pan out then? How early are you planning pantomime?
Interestingly, I was involved last year for the first time with the Gaiety Theatre in Ayr, who had taken the decision to bring their panto in-house, having worked with commercial managements previously. So they brought me in as a kind of joint creative producer and director, and also giving me the opportunity to co-write with a lovely comedian and dame, a guy called Fraser Boyle. With that show, we were talking about it almost 2 years before the first one happened. And I'm working on their show for next year currently. We started work on that in November last year. So
it must be quite confusing though, mentally as well, to try and...
Well, it is, because you're kind of switching gears halfway through. Like, I was busy putting the show on in Ayr whilst thinking about the following year and what we were going to do with Sleeping Beauty, having sent Jack up his beanstalks. And so you have to kind of try and find a degree of separation. Also, from my point of view, having to find a degree of separation between being a co-writer on the show and then switching hat to become the director of the show as well, which was more conscious than I thought it would be. But when I do the commercial pantos, it's a different story, because a lot of the planning work is done by the commercial producers. So with Kudos, for example, you're working with a pre-planned design which has been used before. All the music has been chosen by the musical supervisor and the producer. The casting has all been done by the producers, so you're not involved in any of that, whereas in the Air Pantos and the other Pantos I've done, you're involved in every aspect of that. So it becomes, in a funny way, more of a kind of Meccano kit of a show, but the skill comes, for me, and the interest artistically comes in how you pull together the different things that the different performers are bringing to it. And in the Kudos things, you do genuinely have that variety element where you've got a brilliant ventriloquist. I had the pleasure of working with Paul Zerdin in Cardiff, and I'd never worked with a vent act before, and he was amazing. So I had to learn quickly what he could bring to the show and then make sure that was woven into the fabric of the piece. So that it's challenging and enjoyable for many different reasons.
Is there anything you'd like to still bring into pantomime that you've not seen yet?
Well, that's a really good question. I do like to continue to kind of not just retread old routines, although there is always value in reviving an old routine, as one we were talking about earlier, the balloon dance and Cinderella and stuff. So I love those kind of traditional routines. But for example, last year in Ayr, we knew we wanted to do a milking scene, but we wanted to try and do an entirely new milking scene, which we did. I won't go into too much detail, but Patsy the Coo had erratic bowel syndrome, which did form part of our milking routine.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine. What's it like then trying to direct these slosh scenes? Because I watch them, and my family watch them with me, and we're just in awe that nobody gets hurt.
They are really, really challenging, and I think that's the reason that you don't see as many slosh routines as you used to do, partly because rehearsal times have been squeezed, and slosh routines take an enormous amount of rehearsal to get them right. It's really interesting when you see Clive Adams and can you edit that out?
Of course I can.
Danny Adams and Clive Webb at Newcastle. They do the most outrageous slosh scenes and elaborate slosh scenes I have ever seen in Panto. But that's because they have the opportunity to devise them themselves and then bring it to the Panto rather than it being rehearsed from scratch in a Panto. So they're challenging to do in a limited rehearsal time. One of the nice things at Air was we got an extra week of rehearsals compared to the time I get with a Kudos show. So we had time to develop it and devise it, and obviously Fraser, my co-writer, and myself thought about that a lot in advance and how we would create the routine, and then developed it further with the actors. But I did... The biggest slosh scene I've actually done wasn't in a Panto, but it was in a stage version of Laurel and Hardy's Sons of the Desert. And Sons of the Desert in itself is only an hour long, and we wanted to do it as a full-length show, so we created a first act which was a recreation of Laurel and Hardy doing one of the kind of famous stage shows that they did in the UK in the 40s and 50s. So we did this whole wallpapering routine with buckets of paste and wallpaper going up and down ladders and stuff. But I have to say it probably took up about 60% of the rehearsal time for that whole production, just because it was so intricate. But it really paid off with the audience because the actors were so well rehearsed in it, and we had enormous fun watching it. And one of the greatest things for me is then seeing the audience respond to the material once you get it working on stage, and it's a huge reward. That's why I love doing comedy and love working with comics, because there's such a reward to be had from seeing an audience falling about laughing. I absolutely love that.
Did you go and see much comedy as a child?
No, not live comedy, to be honest. It was, again, as an adult, as a teenager, started to get more and more interested in it on television and in film. Used to love a lot of the old silent films, Buster Keaton and Laurel and Hardy and Charlie Chaplin. I still watch those from time to time and still learn from them, especially timing.
Absolutely, that's what the young comics should be concentrating on as well.
Absolutely, and it's interesting, you see a lot of... Because I see a lot of Pantos, you do see a lot of actors playing comic roles in Panto who actually haven't the same experience or skills that a really good comedian has in terms of knowing how to hold, how to entice an audience, how to bring the audience into them. Quite often they'll just batter the audience over the head with the comedy rather than actually drawing the audience to them, so you can do absolutely anything you like. One of my favourite young comedians around at the moment is Ben Nicholas, who I worked with in Plymouth Theatre Royal in Panto and at Nottingham Theatre Royal, and he's so skilled. And he's also a genuine delight to work with. He's a really lovely guy, but he's only a young guy, but he's a right old-fashioned comedian, and he knows how to work an audience, and he's brilliant, and I just love that skill.
We spoke before we started recording about how theatres and the towns they're in or cities they're in, these performers become superstars in their cities.
It is interesting, isn't it? I discovered that when I went back to Scotland to discover there were people who were really famous in Scotland and could fill a house just by announcing they were in a show. I'm thinking of people like Ricky Fulton, who wasn't really that well. He appeared in a couple of major movies, but he wasn't that well known outside of Scotland. but you just needed to put him in a Molière or a Panto and as the headline act, and the show would be sold out. And it is interesting that still continues around the country, where Beric Kaler in York, who has built up that huge following there, and a special relationship with the audience. And I think audiences do feel that very strongly, especially if it's a performer that can make them laugh. They build a real bond with the performer, and the performer builds a real bond with the audience. You see it with Alan Stewart and Grant Stott and Andy Gray in Edinburgh. Gerard Kelly in Scotland, when he was still alive, just had this unique relationship with the Glasgow audiences. I worked with Kelly on a play on The Odd Couple with him and Andy Gray, which toured to Scotland. And the minute we announced that the pair of them were playing the leads in that, the tickets went flying out the window. And again, it's because they make them laugh, and people feel a genuine affection. I loved old comedians like Jack Milroy in Scotland as well, who, whenever you see his recorded stuff on TV and recordings and archive recordings, still makes me laugh, even though I've seen the routine 100 times. I'm fortunate to work with the Chuckle Brothers on one of their, not the last Panto, sadly it was a couple of years before Barry died, but that was a real eye-opener for me as well, because I was slightly too old to have seen them on television. I was aware of them, but I'd grown up by the time they became mainstream on TV, and so I hadn't been aware of their huge variety history and the Patton brothers and all that the world that they'd come from. So when I got to work with them in Panto, I didn't know what I was going to get, and I was astounded at what a brilliant, utterly brilliant double act they were. They were very nice guys to work with as well. I mean, I had to make sure that I made sure they got the best opportunity to do what they could do best in the show whilst pulling everything else together. But there was no competition whatsoever. And they, a lot of comedians don't like to rehearse or over-rehearse a show because they begin to get paranoid that something's not getting the laughs if they're doing the same two or three different times in rehearsal, and then the laughs start to fade because the company are used to watching it. With the Chuckle Brothers, in rehearsals they were more than willing to do every routine full out if I needed them to, and even in rehearsals, they made it look as though they were doing it for the very first time. Now, these were routines that they'd done for years around the country, but every rehearsal they made me laugh, and every single performance they made me laugh. Sometimes at the same thing, sometimes because just a slight adjustment of timing because of the way the audience were responding. And that's just such a joy to see. And it would be great if everybody who's doing comedy in Panto had the opportunity to see some of these brilliant performers working. The Crankies are the same. I've never worked with them in Panto, although I have seen them in Panto. But they did a variety show at the Edinburgh Fringe a few years back, which was the first time I'd seen them live. And it was like watching a masterclass in a double act. And I'm so appreciative of that skill.
It seems as though double acts are kind of a dying breed now. You don't really see them anymore.
I think that's true. You really don't. I suppose that's because the variety world has changed so much. You do see more modern versions of them, but not the stage double acts. And I think that's why we started talking about kind of performers coming back to venues, but I think that's why when it works, people tend to hang on to performers in a local theatre, because it gives an opportunity for the relationship between the performers to build and the relationship between the performers and the audience to build. And that's a rare opportunity these days, I think.
Coming from Scotland and kind of relocating to the Midlands, how do you find audiences are in Scotland compared to England?
It's really interesting. In Scotland, depending on where you go, audiences are different, and it's the same in England. I mean, I've toured kind of big, open-hearted, working-class comedies to places like Guildford that have died on their arses, but have gone down brilliantly in Darlington, and it's very interesting to see what works where. As far as the difference between Scottish and English audiences are concerned. Even Scotland, there's a difference between East Coast and West Coast, which is really strong.
It's like our north and south divide, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a cliche, but there is a truth in it that in the East Coast, they tend to say, okay, show me what you can do. Oh, that's good. Whereas in Glasgow, people can say, great, show us what you can do. That's brilliant, And it's a more open-hearted, open-armed warmth. But once, in the East Coast, once you're established with the audiences, they're just as open-hearted and just as welcoming.
Because the humour in Scotland that I found, and even watching things such as Two Doors Down and Still Going, the humour is quite sarcastic and quite sometimes cruel.
Yes, it can be.
Does that happen in pantomime as well?
Up to a point. I think the biggest difference I've seen, and it's interesting because I've done a number of kudos shows, and although I'm based in Scotland, they've never given me a Scottish panto. I've always gone to like Nottingham and Plymouth and Cardiff and Richmond and wherever. So the biggest difference between the Scottish and the English pantos, I think, is the use of language and the use of wordplay. Because in Scotland you can get a lot of comedy out of very specific words, phrases, sentences, sentence structures, and Scots is not just an accent, it's a language in itself. And so you hear things in panto especially that you do hear in everyday speech, but you're reminded of in Scottish panto, and there will be whole routines that are built up around Scottish wordplay. Jack Milroy used to do a whole routine called Had a Curry, which was about him going out the night before and had a curry, and then the consequences that followed that. And it wouldn't work in an English accent. It had to work. It only works in Scots. Whereas in I think probably the visual humour is very similar between Scottish and English pantos, but the biggest difference is use of language.
How important then is rhythm of language when it comes to directing for you of any pantomime, be it English or Scottish?
Hugely important. I think that applies right across the board. And it's interesting because I come in originally from a musical background, and music came first, and then theatre, drama came second, and then it kind of tipped on its head during the course of my kind of working career. So I've been very, very aware of the importance of rhythm in not just the rhythm of a speech or a dialogue exchange, but also the rhythm of going from scene to scene, which is hugely important in panto. You need a button on the end of a scene, you need a fast pickup into the next scene, you need to know when to put a full stop on something or when you skip over it. And that is, it's exactly the same principles as music, and bringing a script to life is the same as bringing a piece of music to life. You have a rough go through the whole thing, then you take it apart, dissect it, put it together bit by bit, explore what the timings are, what the dynamics are, and then build it up again. And my input as a director varies enormously depending on the skills and experience of the performer. Sometimes with a performer who's got talent but is inexperienced, you have to guide the rhythm and when to hold it and when to pick it up and when to move it on, or where the emphasis might go in a sentence. And I hate giving line readings. It's much more effective if an actor finds for themselves where the emphasis has to land in a sentence to get the laugh, or even in the setup. If the rhythm of the setup isn't right, then the funny line on tag doesn't get a laugh. So I'd actually find that fascinating, and I learn a lot from watching other people perform, really skilled performers, and I still learn, and I still love that exchange, which can be really funny in rehearsal, but then has to adjust. I suppose I always describe it that when you go from the rehearsal room onto stage and then in front of an audience, you introduce a whole other character into the show. So all the timings have to adjust to accommodate that other character and to build upon what they're throwing into the mix. Having said that, you also then have to be aware of when you're letting them dominate and when you need to take control of the audience, because sometimes if an audience gets in control of the scene, you've lost it, and you won't find the way out of it. So you need to know how to manage and harness the enormous energy that an audience brings to a show as well.
Have you found audiences have changed much over the years? In terms of things such as like attention span and also as well manners, because one thing I'm finding a lot of these days is people have not got any problem at all with getting up in the middle of the show to go for a toilet break.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating as a customer, as a punter, to be getting up out of your seat.
Yeah.
And surely it must be quite frustrating for you as a director to see audiences maybe a decline in standards. I mean, how's that going?
It is. I think in essence they haven't changed. They still will react in the way you want a theatre audience to react if you engage them early on. I think you're possibly right about attention span. But then sometimes it's the responsibility of the people on stage and the people who are putting the show on stage to keep the audience's attention.
Put a maroon on.
Absolutely.
That'll get their attention.
But with the panto in particular, you do have to keep it moving. You can't sit down at any point and just expect the audience to stay with you. You have to keep them engaged. And in terms of audience etiquette, yes, you do see things changing. I think particularly for me, the use of mobile phones in an auditorium. Because no matter how many warnings or kind invitations you have to an audience to switch their phones off, you do see people texting in shows and watching their phone and watching videos on the phone rather than watching the show.
Really?
Yeah, you see that in the West End all the time, and it's infuriating. I mean, it's infuriating when I'm sitting down watching TV and somebody sitting next to me is not watching the visual information in a show, and they say, I'm listening to it, and so it's not the same. You have to take in the whole experience. So yeah, that can be very frustrating. I don't know what we can do to change that. It's interesting with the apparently in the recent Madonna concerts in London, the audiences have had to hand in their phones before being allowed into the auditorium. And that would be a lovely discipline to have. I don't think it's entirely practical for every show, but we have a responsibility to keep the audience engaged. But etiquette is a tricky thing.
Do you like a matinee with all the school children?
I love them. Yeah, I mean I learned that when I was working front of house in Leicester Haymarket, and they tended to do at Christmas. They would do 2 performances of a children's show during the day, and then they would do an adult musical in the evening. So I was aware very early on of the difference between a school's matinee and an adult or a family audience, and they are totally different. What I love about the school shows is the massive wall of reaction you can get, particularly to the goodies and the baddies.
Oh, yeah.
You don't always get the subtleties of the verbal comedy. You always get great reactions to the visual comedy, but then that turns around on its head with I keep saying adult, but I mean family audiences, where you get a lot more of the verbal comedy working well, but you don't get as big a reaction to the audience participation things. It's sometimes a bit more constrained or a wee bit more controllable. I have on occasion seen the audience just like there was one when in Jack and the Beanstalk in Air this year, when Jack was selling the cow. The first 2 or 3 school shows, we could not get the scene to move forward because the audience was shouting so much to try and stop Jack handing over the cow for the gold. And we then had to make a few changes to the scene in order that the actors to keep more control of the audience. So that the first day we did it, we added 5 minutes in that scene alone because we couldn't get the audience to stop shouting at Jack.
Isn't that great though that they're that engaged?
Yes,
to it as well?
That's what I loved about it, and it's especially in that show. The 2 guys inside the Panto cow were doing a brilliant job in animating the cow, so the audience and especially the young kids really believed that Patsy was a character, and not only was she getting laughs with a look or a wink, that she was getting rounds of applause when she came on, and it's great when you see people totally believing in a character like that. Absolutely love it.
Is it quite hard when you've written a script that you've got to self-edit?
Yes. Yeah.
You think you've got like a corker of a scene or a corker of a joke?
Yeah. You often end up with a script pre-rehearsal. We were fortunate last year that we were able to do a reading of the show in September with our entire cast before going on to our final rehearsal draft. So we learned a lot from that and did a lot of editing, got it into rehearsal, and suddenly realised that it needed a whole lot more editing. So we probably cut an extra 20 minutes from the show during the course of rehearsals. And in the end, you have to be ruthless with your own material. There's no point it being 20 minutes too long, because you don't want to cut material, because the shorter and sharper it is, the more effective it is.
So without being self-indulgent.
Yeah, and as soon as you get it in front of an audience, you realise if there's a moment where you have been indulgent or you've just let it sit too long. And generally I'm quite good at being able to identify that and cut it. It's not always popular with the performers, and I sometimes break my own heart to have to cut a line you really like or a gag you really like. But if it's superfluous, you've just got to get rid of it.
Save it for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got a whole scene that I wrote for last year's Panto that ultimately was just going to make that one particular scene 10 minutes too long. But I know it's a good scene, but I'm going to save it for the show after this year.
Tech Week, do you enjoy it?
Yes and no. What I don't enjoy is the time pressure, because you're working against a ticking clock all the time. But I do love the process of lighting the show, getting the sound right, getting the scene changes working, and all the prop business and so forth. And I actually enjoy the mechanics of putting it all together. What can make it really difficult is the time pressure. And that's the only time where I feel my blood pressure starting to rise. But, if you've got a decent amount of tech time and you're moving forward, nothing's holding you up, it can be really enjoyable. The most enjoyable is often those quiet late night lighting sessions when it's just you, the lighting designer, the sound operator, the board operator, and the DSM, and you're sitting plotting the whole show in the quiet and just crafting it without the pressure of everything else around you. That's a really enjoyable moment for me.
What's it like then on the first sort of evening of curtain up? Do you get nervous?
Not nervous so much as kind of anxious that everything goes the way you want it to go. And that's probably more what I feel rather than nerves itself, because generally you have confidence in the people you've got on stage. Occasionally you've been there with someone who you think, God, are they going to make it or not? Are they going to remember the right line? Are they going to remember to get off stage without the cloth hitting them and so forth? But no, generally it's more about a willingness for it to all to go right. On the gala night of Jack and the Beanstalk last year, we had a beanstalk malfunction, and it all had to happen within a set time, within a number. That the fairy waves her wand, the beanstalk starts to grow, and it was an inflatable beanstalk, which, as well as inflating, has a guideline which then lifts it, so it's growing upwards as it's inflating outwards. And for some reason, the guideline had been attached but came adrift. So when the beanstalk started inflating, it just got fat and didn't start to grow. And of course, the beanstalk needs to be there for the Act 1 to end. If it doesn't reach up into the sky, Jack's never going to get up to the top of it. So the beanstalk had inflated fully, but hadn't gone upwards by the time we got to the end of the number. So the dame comes out to discover the beanstalk is there, and I have to say, Chris Forbes, who played our dame, who's a comedian as well as an actor, got a huge amount of comedic value out of the fact that it had obviously gone wrong. The audience were in on the act, but thankfully a very quick-thinking member of our ensemble saw what had happened, saw the guideline, attached it to the beanstalk, and then the guys on the flies pulled the beanstalk out. So they allowed the scene to progress, and the beanstalk was just at its height, just before Jack needed to start climbing it. But my heart was in my mouth, and I'm up at the back of the auditorium. The air is going blue. The audience are loving it, but I'm going to go, how do we finish the act if the beanstalk doesn't go up in the air?
Was it weird then, the actual transition into pantomime then, breaking the fourth wall?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Again, it's something about a lot of Scottish theatre uses that breaking. There's a kind of thing which has become known as Ceilidh theatre in Scotland, where you do break the fourth wall constantly to turn out of a scene and engage the audience in it. So it's something I was perhaps more familiar with as a director working in Scotland than maybe a director who's not worked in Panto elsewhere in the UK would be familiar with. So for me, it was an automatic thing to be able to do and to be used to doing. But you treat the audience as if they're part of the action. And like I always like to, when I'm working with someone in the comic role or the dame, I always like to say to them, you have to treat the audience as if they're your best friend, as they're a member of the cast, they're part of the story, and your engagement with them needs to be that, not as if they're the audience. They're part of the story.
You said about the challenge with an unruly beanstalk. How do you cope with illnesses then within the company?
Well, again, that can be really difficult and different depending on the circumstances you're working in. With the big commercial pantos, you've got built-in understudy cover. At Ayr, you've got a smaller company. We had a cast of 10, so we'd structured it that there were 6 principal characters and 4 ensemble characters. And we'd structured it in such a way that if any of the principal characters were off, an ensemble member would then come out of the ensemble to step up. It's challenging in those circumstances because you then leave a hole in the ensemble. And in some shows they don't have any understudy cover at all, so it can be really, really difficult. But I have to say, most performers I've worked with rarely go off and rarely get sick. It did happen last year, where somebody had to step up from the ensemble to play one of the principal roles for one performance. But they did brilliantly. They filled the gaps, and in my experience, performers are hugely resourceful and pull the most amazing things out of the hat when required.
And that will obviously go towards them in future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also we do make sure that we have given at least some rehearsal time to the understudies and to people covering roles.
What do you do then after pantomime?
Usually go and lie down in a darkened room.
How long for?
At least a week. Actually, it can feel like that, but you do need recovery time. I think it's important. I'm fortunate in that it usually works out that I do get a short break after Panto opens before going on to the next project. And you do need it to refresh your batteries, and a lot of performers are the same. If they're doing a big heavy Panto schedule where they're doing 12 shows a week, they'll usually have a holiday booked in January.
What would be your advice for up-and-coming directors?
See as much as you can, really. I think it's important, especially with Panto, not to know just how to put a show on, but to understand what the traditions are. And that's not saying necessarily you have to always obey the traditions, but if you're going to subvert them, then you need to know what you're subverting or what you're reinventing and why you're doing it. Is it to make it better, or is it just for your own ego? So I would say kind of keep those as touchstones and see as much as you can, see as many performances as you can, get to know what people are doing, learn some of the old routines as well, because I've seen shows where the thing that is getting the laugh is probably the oldest routine in the book, but it still feels fresh because it's genuinely funny. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think would probably be my most important note.
What are your favourite routines then over the years?
Oh, that's a really good question. I do love the behind you gags, and the routine which I've seen in many different incarnations, where you get the ghost coming on, scaring characters off, only to be left with the dame, who then scares them and they run off. It's amazing how many times audiences have seen that and how they still laugh. So I love those kind of old-fashioned routines as well. And I love the balloon routine, the busy bee routine, all these kind of things. They're great fun.
So you make sure that you keep that tradition still in your pantomimes as well now?
Yes, although I'm very careful not to do everything in every panto. I think you need to keep tricks up your sleeve so you can keep it fresh and you can keep reinventing. And if you are going to bring an old routine back, that it's not just the same as the year before, because the audiences will tire of it, and they do want to, as well as being given familiar stuff, they want to be given fresh stuff as well.
Are there any pantomimes that are harder to stage than others?
I think so. There are some stories where the story structure really loans itself to panto, and there are some that don't. I think for me the one, and I've never directed it as a panto, but the one that I've never really seen work satisfactorily as a panto is Peter Pan. And it's not because it's not a good story, and it's not because I've not seen good Peter Pans, but it's just that the story starts in the nursery, so you can't open with a big opening village scene and introduce the ensemble and the characters. The story structure is different. The goodie and the baddie are very different, and you still get the same struggle of good versus evil, which is the core to any really good panto, but it's harder to do. I'm doing Sleeping Beauty this year, which I've never done as a panto, even though it does get done regularly. And there are things within that in a contemporary context which you have to think, well, how do I do that now? You've got your central character who, in some versions of the story, doesn't appear till halfway through Act 1 because she's a baby when the show starts. She then falls asleep at the end of Act 1, doesn't wake up to the end of Act 2. So you think, well, how do you keep that central character at the centre of the story? So there are challenges with some stories where I think probably my favourite panto is Aladdin, because you get the brilliant mix of comedy, adventure, magic, glitter, all combining in that one story, and the structure of the story is really good for the panto format. So that's probably my favourite. The director I trained with, who I mentioned before, Joan Knight, she had one simple rule for panto, and that was don't stint on the glint, because she felt it was important that you gave the audience sparkle and magic in a panto, and Aladdin allows you to do all of that by the bucket load.
Oh yes, yeah. Just a bit.
Yeah.
Up in Scotland, I'm seeing in a lot of pantomime, I'm seeing as well a lot of inventive new ideas. I mean, we've got Kudos this year bringing out Humpty Dumpty for the first time in goodness knows how long.
Yeah.
We had Goldilocks kind of re-emerging. Up in Scotland, you see Pinocchio.
Yeah. Mother Goose gets done a lot in Scotland. It doesn't get done quite so much in England. It's interesting.
Canterbury, I think, did that the other year. But
yeah.
Is there anything that you'd like to attempt?
Do you know, that's a very good question. I did a research for an exhibition about panto when I was in my 20s, and I was amazed to find there were loads and loads of stories that regularly used to get used for panto, like Goldilocks and Humpty Dumpty, that have only recently started to re-emerge again. Things like Puss in Boots doesn't get done at all, although you would think with Shrek that might be a show that might emerge again. I think it's important to look around and find what the alternatives, because it's easy to get stuck in the small major five pantos, five or six that always get done time and time again. So I think it is good that companies are delving around. Rapunzel got done in a panto, as a panto last year in Scotland. I've never seen that done as a panto before, and because of the Disney film Beauty and the Beast has been reinvented as a panto as well, and Pinocchio as well. Pinocchio is a slightly harder one to do as a panto because it's a journey story, which is different from some of the other ones, but yeah, that's a good question. I'll need to get my thinking cap on and see if I can find a new story to tell.
Well, there we go. A lot of it, though, is Disneyfication, isn't it?
Yeah, and that comes down to the commercialism. A lot of theatres need their pantos to sell well because they are expensive and because they pay to the biggest audience of the year. So I think that does tend to influence some of the stories we're seeing regularly because they've been done again more recently by Disney, and so audiences will more readily respond to something they are familiar with than something they don't know. But I think ultimately it's about finding a balance between the sellability of your show and the interest of a show.
Have you ever been in a situation where ticket sales aren't where you really want them to be before a run?
Not with Panto, no. I've been pretty lucky that most of the shows I've done have I've been in theatres where there's been a tradition of theatre going, and particularly a tradition of panto going. But there's nothing more disheartening than when you see a show that isn't selling well. And also panto is peculiar in that even no matter how good your panto is, the success of it usually depends on the success of the year before. So if the year before hasn't done especially well, it will affect the current year. Whereas if the current year does well, then you know that next year will do better. And I think that's quite honestly because panto for some people is the only thing they will go and see in a year, and if they don't enjoy it, they won't go back. So you have a duty to make it as good as you can so that people will come back and want to come back.
Do you ever dream about panto in your sleep?
Yes. I've had numerous nights with lack of sleep in the last few weeks trying to work out Sleeping Beauty in my head. And it's only January. Well, it's February now. But
where then are you sort of getting your ideas from for that? Because obviously you've got the Disney film, but two Disney films, aren't there? The Maleficent and the original.
Yes. I think obviously you're aware of those, but as you're not looking to duplicate those Disney films. I got really annoyed when in Aladdin, instead of the villain being called Abanazar, he suddenly started to get called Jafar in a lot of pantos, and I didn't yield to that temptation. But for me, I always go back to the root of the story, which is the traditional stories. So, for example, with Sleeping Beauty, we've gone back to the original Charles Perrault story and the Grimm brothers version of it, which was Briar Rose. So I've gone back to those as the source material, and also that a lot of those stories go even further back in tradition. And so you look at what was originally in the story, what's useful now, and what contemporary slant can we bring to that. And that's actually why all the pantos I've done, I've never done as a solo writer. I've always collaborated with other writers. And I think that process of bouncing ideas back and forward, especially with someone whose skills are complementary to yours, with Fraser Boyle. Fraser is a brilliant comedian and is great at writing witty and pithy, funny dialogue, whereas my strength comes in story structure and storytelling. But the more we work together, the more those lines blur, which is good, and we kind of edit each other's work and embellish each other's work as well. So that sense of collaboration always makes it better than if you're just working on your own.
Well, this brings me to my very last question. Your dream pantomime. Now, you can be in it, you can direct it if you'd like, you could even tread the boards if you felt brave enough, or you could be selling the ice creams at the interval. You can choose the theatre, you can choose your cast, alive or dead, and obviously your production.
Oh gosh, that is such a difficult question. It would have to be Aladdin, and I would love to do it at my hometown, which is Glasgow, at the King's Theatre in Glasgow, and I would love to have done it with Stanley Baxter. I think that would be my dream team.
Just Stanley.
Well, what else do you need? No, of course you would. Yes. Actually, do you know, one of the traditions I am sorry has disappeared a bit is the female principal boy, because again in those old pantos there were some brilliant female principal boys around, and what's happened since the female principal boy has disappeared is that a lot of pantos have become imbalanced in terms of this the gender divide. So with the ones I've been doing, I've been looking at, okay, well, we've made a principled decision that it has to be 50-50, so you look at what other characters can be male and female if it's not going to be the principal boy and the dame. So I would, if I was doing one of those big old pantos, it would, I would want a female principal boy, possibly someone like Faye Lenore, who was a huge famous principal boy in Glasgow, or in Scotland. And I would want Pat McCann to be the musical director. First time I ever went to the King's Theatre in Edinburgh was to see, I think it was Ricky Fulton and Walter Carr in Cinderella with Pat McCann and his orchestra. And when the overture struck up, you got all this brass saxophones, a big 12-piece theatre orchestra. You thought, wow, I'm at a theatre show. I would love to see that come back.
Does that kind of annoy you that we've gone more click track?
It's a necessity because of cost these days, and I understand the practicalities of that. But if it was down to me and I had a limitless purse, I would have a full band, and I would have the ensemble all singing live. We do that in air. Yeah, we do. We only have 3 in the band, which is usually bass, keyboards, and percussion, and we do fill out the arrangements with some clicking. Some click tracks, but all the singing is live.
What's your take, by the way, on having female uglies? Because that's become a new thing now.
Yeah, I've seen it done really well, and I certainly don't think we shouldn't. I don't think we should fight it. I think we should embrace it, and it's about getting the gender balance in the panto as a whole. I do love the tradition of a male dame, but I think if you're going to have a male dame, then you have to find that balance elsewhere in the panto, like sometimes having a female villain instead of a male villain, or whatever, or a female comic instead of a male comic. I don't think we need to necessarily restrict ourselves with those rules. The most important thing is you get people who are good at the job rather than what their sex is.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking part in the Panto podcast.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.